Washington. Welcome to our fair and windy city today. My name is Margarete Strand, and I'm the Deputy Director for the BlueGreen Alliance. We are a partnership between 10 major U.S. labor unions and 4 large U.S. environmental organizations based here in D.C. We were founded on the premise that investing in environmental solutions is the fastest and most efficient way to strengthen our economy, put people back to work, and reduce our emissions in the process. So I'm very pleased and very appreciative of UNEP adding this panel called Investing in Green, Strategies Behind Green Jobs Initiatives, and to moderate what I hope is going to be a very timely and engaging conversation. We have a rather unique and diverse panel here, spanning from private sector to organized labor, to think tanks, to the World Bank, and so I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, and also including you in the conversation. So think about your questions and inputs as we hear about this. And obviously the backdrop for this is, as we're grappling with this conference, the global economic situation and the tough times that we're facing in the U.S. and internationally. Dramatic sustained unemployment, not that many bright spots on the horizon. So then the questions become, can the clean energy economy and the so-called green jobs be a path out of this economic dire situation that we're in? Can it provide the type of economic growth that we all would like to see, that not only has the growth, but that also has the employment growth as well? What do we even mean when we talk about green jobs? What is that? In what context? What sectors? What industries? When we look in the U.S. context, we see sort of attack on green jobs right now with Solyndra, a U.S. solar company that received about $500 million in federal stimulus funds, shutting down in August. Is that the exception or the trend? How do we support these emerging industries in renewables and efficiency, and how do we get it to scale at the speed that we need to? And what is the role of the government in all of these policies, whether in the U.S. or also internationally? We will admit that we have a rather U.S.-focused panel here, so I think we will probably focus more on some of what's happening in the U.S. But I think, as we'll hear from some of our panelists as well, these are questions that are being discussed all over the world, and again, welcome your feedback and thoughts on this. And finally, again, looking at it from the more international point of view, how does international competitiveness, how does trade, how do some of these competitive issues factor in terms of how this new clean energy economy grows and so forth? So those are some of the things, a rather ambitious agenda for an hour and a half, but some of the things that we're going to be talking about. What we're going to do is get some brief introductions from our panelists and then have some discussion here, but really also open it up for you all in the podium. In the audience, rather, we're up here. So we're going to open by focusing on some of the more macroeconomic side of these issues in terms of employment trends, in terms of sort of the big picture, in terms of the economic recovery and so forth. John Creyts is the principal who's sitting here to my left. He's a principal in the Chicago office of McKinsey and Company and is a leader in McKinsey's global energy and materials practice. He's also their U.S. lead on the Special Initiative on Climate Change, and he is one of the principal authors of McKinsey's recent survey, Reducing U.S. Greenhouse Gas Emission, How Much at What Cost? So John, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Margarete. And thank you to my distinguished fellow panelists and to you, the audience, for joining us here today to discuss what is perhaps the most pressing economic challenge facing America: jobs. There aren't enough of them now. And if current trends persist, there won't be enough in the future. There are now 7 million fewer employed Americans than before the 2008 recession began, and over 4 million people have been out of work for more than a year. This is a crisis for the unemployed and their families, and for America as a whole. Recent research by our think tank, the McKinsey Global Institute, highlights the challenge ahead. As an economy, we need to create 21 million jobs to regain full employment by 2020. Based on our analysis, only in the most optimistic scenarios, a speedy rebound to the pace of investment and new business starts on par with what we achieved in early 2007, will we have a chance to fill this gap. The prognosis is not so dire for GDP, however. Since 1991, we are seeing a trend toward jobless recoveries, where the efficiencies gained during the downturn fuel the return to prosperity, but with fewer jobs required. Recent trends suggest that there could be a 60-month delay from the time we hit our pre-recession peak to the point where we achieve the same level of employment again. This compares to lags of 4 to 6 months for all recessions prior to 1990. I reiterate, this is a crisis. In the context of this challenge, the prospect of recreating our nation's energy and resource infrastructure stands as a particularly compelling job creation opportunity. Our current energy system uses 19th century technology, largely developed by the likes of Edison, Westinghouse, Otto, and Diesel. We spent most of the 20th century deploying these technologies in a great national effort, moving people off the farm and into cities, and in the process developed the most competitive economy in the world. The national electric grid, the national highway system, the national oil and gas production and pipeline networks were among the greatest engineering and economic achievements of the 20th century. We stand prepared to take the next great leap forward. The development and deployment of new technologies will combat our current challenges of energy security, affordability, and cleanliness by offering the potential for abundant, efficient, and emission-free alternatives. As we migrate toward that vision, there are 3 opportunities of particular relevance to the scale of the employment challenge we face today: energy efficiency, distribution infrastructure, and clean generation. Energy efficiency is a compelling focus for green job creation because it is an investment with a clear return. McKinsey analysis suggests that if we were to capture all attractive energy efficiency options in the United States through 2020, it would cost us roughly $500 billion while yielding approximately $1.2 trillion in benefits. Mobilizing to capture this at scale would create up to 500,000 jobs, both direct and indirect, over the next 10 years, while simultaneously enhancing U.S. competitiveness and reducing energy bills for all. A similar twofer that provides near-term jobs with long-term advantage is restoring and upgrading our nation's distribution infrastructure. Much of this network is aging and in need of refurbishment. By upgrading thoughtfully, we can create the backbone for a dynamic energy economy that includes distributed generation, storage, and electrified mobility. The cost for the upgrade would be on the order of about $50 billion annually, approximately double what we're spending today or triple what our historical levels have been, adding up to 100,000 more jobs locally across the country. Finally, clean generation draws approximately $25 billion in annual investment today, primarily in the solar in the Southwest and wind in the West and Midwest. It's currently a balanced system, but could fall back dramatically without clear policy, potentially jeopardizing up to 100,000 jobs. To unlock or preserve these and other opportunities, there are 4 key issues the U.S. must address to make substantive progress against the current job crisis. First, skill. Based on our current trajectory, by 2020, we'll have a surplus of over 5 million workers with a high school diploma or less, and a deficit of as much as 1.5 million workers who are college graduates. The science, technology, engineering, and math tracks, critical skills for the development of our clean economy, lag other education tracks substantially, creating a skill mismatch that will only worsen over time. Targeted scholarships, improving vocational training, and job retraining programs are among a few policy options to consider. Second, share. To create jobs, the U.S. is going to have to do a better job of competing for them globally. This is not about economic subsidies, protective tariffs, or trade policies, but rather about creating distinctive competitive advantages that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Examples include industrial clusters, access to key knowledge or resources, integrated supplier ecosystems that foster improved cost performance, or local availability of superior talent pools. Such strategies can increase foreign direct investment in the U.S. and help repatriate jobs that had previously gone abroad. Third, spark. The U.S. needs to reignite innovation. Here, the green technology movement offers fertile ground to germinate and grow new companies rapidly. Remember, every new company creates new jobs. Our estimates suggest that the fall-off in new business starts since the onset of the economic crisis have cost us roughly 2 million jobs to date. Incentivizing investment in startups, providing policies that help manage new business risk, and streamlining the regulatory burden on small and growing businesses can help. Fourth, speed. Uncertainty over the direction of regulation and the time and expense required to comply with current requirements has made some companies hesitant to invest. We need to make it faster and easier to do business in the United States. Plug-and-play enterprise zones, fast-track permitting options, and coordinated federal, state, and local development regulations can help. A focus on addressing these 4 challenges, skill, share, spark, and speed, is required if we are to successfully unlock the full potential for green jobs growth. Let me close by saying that while the current jobs crisis is among the toughest challenges we face in America, our focus today is on the sector that offers great hope and promise to help meet that need ahead. If we can drive energy, innovation, and establish an investment-friendly environment for green growth, the U.S. can build leadership positions for the 21st century, just as our predecessors did in the prior. I look forward to discussing more shortly. I'm going to turn over the stage to my fellow panelist, Jonathan Rothwell, but not before recognizing the tremendous contribution that he and his organization have had to the debate on green jobs. We at McKinsey have been particularly appreciative of his and his organization's support to advance our thinking. For that, we're grateful. I'll leave it to him to frame up more of the definitions of green jobs for the remainder of our discussion.
Great. And Jonathan, thank you for being here today. And I think getting some perspectives from you, you're obviously the senior research analyst at Brookings Institute, and we're part of releasing this report, Sizing the Clean Economy and National and Regional Green Jobs Assessment, looking at more of the concrete questions of what is a green job, where are they, is it indeed a growing sector and industry or not? Is it hype and just sexy terms, or is there actually reality in terms of how this sector has grown? So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, John, for your gracious comment there. Let me just give a little bit of background about the Brookings Institution and especially the Metropolitan Policy Program, which is where I work. We've been wrestling over the last couple of years with what are the engines of growth are going to be going forward. How are we going to get out of this recession? What needs to happen? One area that we wanted to look at was the green economy. So there's definitely an economic motivation for looking into this. Of course, there's also the immense environmental challenges that we face in the United States and globally. And really, in my mind, there's no way to overcome them without major advances in clean technology. So we embarked upon an 18-month research project to document the size and characteristics of the green economy, try to get a sense of the trend in employment. And let me first start with the definition that we ended up on. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel in terms of defining the green economy. There's been some great work done internationally by the OECD and Eurostat. They have a major handbook of how to measure environmental goods and services. We definitely made use of that. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics more recently has developed a definition of green jobs and the green economy, and they will be releasing the results of 2 surveys sometime in the spring of next year. And we adopted largely their definition, which is very similar to the Eurostat definition, and just made some small changes. But the basic idea is to focus on the production side of the green economy. And by that measure, a green job is one that adds value to a product that benefits the environment. So we count all employees of a company that is focused on the green economy, from the janitors to the accountants, the production line workers, if it's a manufacturing plant, to the CEOs. What we leave out, we take a broad, and as I said, we're focusing on any product that has an environmental benefit, not just one that reduces carbon emissions, but products that that recycle, that manage waste properly. So it's a broad definition, but what we excluded was workers that contribute to the environment through the process of their job. So environmental sustainability officers, for example, at a company like Walmart, were not included. If you want that information, you can look into the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They will have a separate survey that gets at that, but we're really focused on the production side. So when implementing this definition, there are a couple of different approaches we could have taken. We decided not to do a survey because there are many challenges in just figuring out what the right sample is, and frankly, it's very expensive to do a national survey in the United States. So we decided on building up a list of every green company in the United States from the ground up. At least that's the ambition. Of course, we failed to do that, but we did the best we could in the time that we had. So what that means is that we basically created a library of lists from industry associations like the American Wind and Energy Association, their members, to certifications like Energy Star, which is certified by the Department of Energy, to patents that are relevant for the clean economy. So we drew from a wide swath of lists to pull this database of companies together. And what did we find? We found that when you add up all these jobs across different sectors and industries, you get 2.7 million jobs in the United States. And that's roughly 2% of total employment. And you may ask, is that a big number or not? We like to compare it to other cross-cutting sectors. It's slightly bigger than what you'd get if you focused on the fossil fuel industry, including the manufacturers of petroleum products and the gas station attendants even. It's somewhere in between what you'd get if you looked at the biotech sector, which is somewhat smaller, and the information technology sector, or the producers of information technology, I should clarify, which is somewhat larger. So it's a modest but fairly sizable chunk of the current U.S. economy, and I should point out that some of these companies have been around for decades. Some of their activities have been around for decades, like recycling and waste management. We included regulators at the EPA. So some of it has been around for a long time. But then you've got, of course, the new, exciting, clean technology producers. And it all adds up to a very diverse set of companies. So let me talk about the growth now. The growth reflects the diversity across these segments. We divided them into 39 different segments. What we found is that the clean technology sector, roughly defined as the 13 youngest segments, and this includes solar photovoltaic, solar thermal, smart grid, geothermal, wind, electric vehicles, I could go on. This set of segments grew at an extremely rapid rate from a small base. So they grew at least twice as fast as jobs did nationally from 2003 to 2010. Unfortunately, though, many of the older manufacturers, in some cases very large production plants, decreased employment in rather large numbers, and this in many ways coincided with the recession, which hit the green economy in many ways just as much as it hit the rest of the economy, and in some cases even more, because the green economy is disproportionately represented in manufacturing, which along with construction was the worst hit industry in the United States. And of course, the building sector and construction plays a big role in the green economy. 40% of all electricity production comes from the building sector. So many green jobs are in that sector, trying to reduce energy consumption, or providing things like wood for building homes made from recycled products and so on. So the growth was mixed, but the newer sectors are doing very well. Just to give you a few other characteristics, the green economy we found is about twice as export-oriented per job than jobs are nationally in the United States. And if you add up the value of exports in the green economy, you get to something like $50 billion 2009. So that's encouraging to us insofar as exports are going to be, we think, increasingly important in the U.S. and they have been for decades, despite the decline in U.S. manufacturing. And we actually have a trade surplus in green technology, according to data that we analyze separately from the International Trade Administration. And just a couple other characteristics here before I turn it over. There are more opportunities for better pay in the green economy for less educated workers. And this is very important, we think, for the reasons that John was mentioning, that we do have this significant skills gap, and the unemployment rates for educated workers are considerably lower than they are for workers with a high school diploma. So it's encouraging to us that many of the jobs are, in fact, available for workers with less education in fields like production and transportation, construction, installation, and maintenance. These are disproportionately represented across the spectrum of the green economy. And wages, it turns out, are about 13% higher on average, because you don't have the lowest paying occupations playing as big a role. And then finally, because I'm in the Metropolitan Policy Program, I feel like I really need to mention this. Where these jobs are operating, where the companies are operating, has an effect on how competitive they are. One of our findings was that more clustered companies grew faster from 2003 to 2010. So it was helpful to, if you're a solar manufacturer, to be around other solar manufacturers. And there are many reasons why that may be the case, and we could get into some of those. But I do think it's important to recognize the role of regions, and as John was saying, the role of industry clusters.
Great.
So, and just finally to summarize, there is some reason for optimism when looking at green jobs. There's certainly not a myth. There is some excitement there, but the fastest growth is currently in the smallest segments of the green economy, and the slowest growth within the biggest, older segments that are shifting to become more green. So we really need to figure out a way to scale up those smaller segments.
Great. Thank you for that. Very helpful. We're going to move over also to the, We're going to move over to looking at it also from an international perspective. And I'm really happy to welcome Jordan Schwartz here. He's the lead infrastructure economist for the World Bank's Latin America and Caribbean region, where he focuses on investment design, strategies, logistics, regulation, and regional integration. He's also a core member of the World Bank's global expert team on public-private partnerships. And so, Jordan, really excited that you can be here to talk a little bit about how the World Bank sees these trends, the prospect of economic growth and job creation from sort of an international perspective. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'll try to speak on behalf of the rest of the world.
Thank you. He was modest saying you could only speak for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that's bold enough, but we'll give him the world today. Thank you.
I can just about see you if I do this, but could I just ask people to raise a hand if you have a rough idea of what the World Bank does? So I know who I have to put my glasses on, actually not. Okay, so you know who I am. I don't need to apologize too much or explain in great detail how we come at this issue. It's the question of greening growth and greening jobs is a bit different from perspective from an international organization such as the World Bank, I presume the UN or the regional development banks as well. We're sort of looking at two things. We're looking at how to define growth in such a way that we recognize the value of the natural endowment that our client countries have. We value what has traditionally been considered an externality and try to find a way to internalize in decision-making all of the value that comes with non-replenishable resources. That's one thing. And the other thing is to make sure that the things we're financing the investments that are being made with our money are green. So we have traditionally cared about growth and, as an extension of that, jobs, and there's a disconnect there that's worth a whole other session, but maybe not such an interesting session as this one. So I'll blend a little bit the terminology of growth and jobs, if that's okay, and you can pick on me later if that's an issue of interest to you. But on the green side, the other side of our work has been, in the last few years in particular, as we're playing catch-up on this topic, is to try to figure out whether our investments are sustainable and whether they're sustainable in an environmentally sound manner. So what I thought I'd do is I just lay out really quickly what we view as the main challenges of green growth and investment. And there is sort of a Latin America bias to what I'm about to say, but maybe I can find a way to phrase it in a broader context from the perspective of the developing world more broadly. In our region, as with much of the developing world, the possible exception of Europe and Central Asia, we are urbanizing. We've been urbanizing for quite some time in Latin America and the Caribbean region. And there are very special environmental pressures that come from that urbanization and the footprints of the cities and the way in which resources are used. Motorization in particular comes to mind, but other environmental pressures on water resources and on coastal communities, what they're doing to their coastal zones as well. We're in a commodity-rich region, Latin America. We're commodity exporting and commodity dependent. 90% of the population lives in net commodity exporting countries, and 95% of our region's GDP is in net commodity exporting countries. And on the flip side of that, we're basically exporting to China for the most part. So we have maybe the bipolar growth centers in the world outside of the United States and Europe. Not that we're growing much in the OECD these days, but as we see poles of growth developing elsewhere, we have some that are pulling commodities and some that are pushing commodities. And I guess that's a theme that's really important to us, that if we don't find a way to value those natural resources and to make decisions that protect those resources, or at least extract the rents from those sales and return them to other drivers of growth like human capital, then in effect we are subsidizing China's growth with our natural endowment. And that's not what we would want to encourage our countries to do in the long run. We have a highly unequal distribution of wealth. This is true for all of the developing regions. Actually, it's true for the United States as well. This puts a very particular type of pressure on land use and access to services. We have grossly underinvested in infrastructure. I guess as an American, this is a topic that seems familiar too. And we need to catch up. We need to catch up in order to grow. And so the question of whether expanding investment in infrastructure is in itself going to be another set of pressures on our environment is something we're very concerned about, how one goes about moving from 2 to 3% of GDP investment in infrastructure to something closer to 5, 6, 7%, so that these economies can compete and converge with the economies of the OECD and even with the growth rates of East Asia. We have a region that is highly susceptible to climate impacts. So I don't know how much we'll be talking about green in the context of resilience or adaptation to climate change, but that's something that we're very concerned about, and we spend a lot of time and money investing in with our client countries to make them more resilient. And we have a region that's kind of strange. It contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm choosing one definition of green. Jonathan was careful and right to point out that there's a broader definition out there that is relevant for job creation and for growth. Just for this purposes, I'll pick on greenhouse gas emissions for a moment and point out that in Latin America in particular, it's somewhat different from the rest of the developing world. About half of our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions comes from land use changes, from agriculture, for example, or from deforestation and degradation of forests, and about half comes through energy use, transport, and industry. So the region holds the world's greatest carbon sink, sits in the middle of booming and dynamic economies. I mean, the Amazon, of course. And this is a major challenge. For 10 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per capita right now, as compared to 16 in wealthy countries, but only 3 in China and India, 7 across the world. So Latin America, probably because of its urbanization, but also because of its land use, its effects on land use, and its effect on the Amazon and on the carbon sinks of Latin America has been so great, is a fairly high emitter of greenhouse gases. And I think when we think about all these challenges, we sort of want to do an accounting of what resources we have at hand to sort of throw against all of these challenges. And we don't have a lot. I won't go through this in too much detail, and probably the UN is as more familiar with these than I am, but we have a few $1 billion of money from clean technology funds and strategic climate funds. GEF spends about $500 million a year. That's a global environmental facility. We have carbon finance funds, about $2 billion globally. The clean development mechanisms, the forest carbon partnership facilities got a couple $100 million. I mean, it's not a lot. It's a lot of money if it were in our pockets, but it's not a lot of money given the size of the challenge. And you put that against the demand for addressing these issues and the cost of that demand. I won't go sector by sector through this thing, but just to give a sense on the energy side, just to pick out electricity generation, the capacity requirements. Right now, we estimate that from today to 2030, demand will more than double for electricity in Latin America from 1,150 terawatt hours to 2,500 terawatt hours, which means new electricity generation capacity about 240 gigawatts required. That's $450, $500 billion between now and 2030. So that's just Latin America's energy needs between now and 2030 compared to those few $1 billion that are available across the whole world. And so there's only so many rivers that Latin America is going to be able to dam over the next 30 years. And you can imagine what the pressures are going to be to look at a different base load for energy, to start to diversify towards fossil fuels to a thermal energy base. On the transport side, we have motorization rates of 4.5% per year. 4.5% per year. I mean, it's huge. It's like China's rates, except the region's already urban. It's already 78% of the population is already in cities, and the pressures that puts on the environment are tremendous. So, how we're going to mine this gap is kind of a big question, and I think this is where the esteemed colleagues on this panel can help us to kind of think this thing through. Because if in the U.S. we can't figure out how to tackle this thing, Lord knows how we're going to do it in countries that have a $1,200 per year per capita income. It's quite a struggle. I mean, I think one thing that hopefully we can talk about a little bit is the amount of subsidies that are going to the energy industry. And I mean subsidies not for research and development, but I mean subsidies on the brown side. You see about $310 billion to energy consumption across the globe per year. $300 billion is a lot of money. And they're regressive, a lot of these subsidies. So they're not even, sort of a pro-poor argument for doing this doesn't really hold water when you pick apart errors of inclusion and exclusion and how these subsidies trickle down to consumers. In transport, the co-benefits of if we could improve congestion, if we could improve our if we could deal with congestion by investing in mass transit systems, integrated urban transport systems, we'd see all kinds of benefits. And maybe if we calculate those co-benefits, what the society gets from these investments, we could help mine that gap between supply and demand. We estimate that there are 35,000 annual premature deaths in Latin America and the Caribbean just from transport-related particulates from air pollution. So these are the kinds of struggles that we're having. We ourselves, as I mentioned before, to keep it within the family and maybe the couple people that are watching on the web stream, this is something we're playing catch up on ourselves. 4 or 5 years ago, the World Bank merged the infrastructure family where I came from with the environmental and socially sustainable development family and created sort of a sustainable development network in every region across the World Bank. we work as one group, and it's been quite a struggle. It's been quite interesting, and as an infrastructure economist, it's been fantastic to be able to work now from the perspective of green objectives not being an external safeguard, pain in the neck, how do I deal with it and still get my project through, to actually trying to value those externalities and bring them into our decision-making process, which in essence is what we're all about. I think everybody, one way or another on this panel, is about that, right? How do we bring this into policy-making, into investment decision-making, and spur economic activity, looking at it as a net positive and valuing those externalities. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you. So lots of questions that are being raised there, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about some of those questions, because I think they are equally valid in the international scene as domestically when you start looking at subsidies and growth patterns. But before we move over to that, we're going to take it back to the U.S. again. Jeff Rickert directs the AFL-CIO, which is a large labor federation in the U.S. It's Center for Green Jobs, and is also the deputy director of AFL-CIO's Working for America Institute. Obviously, when we talk about job creation and we talk about the kind of unemployment rates that we see now, we have seen over the years a great deal of interest from unions in looking at the clean energy sector, and also looking at it from the point of view of, are green jobs necessarily good jobs? What kind of workforce development tools do we need? How do we use this in a way to build up industries that, for example, left this country, like manufacturing and so forth? Jeff helped start the Apollo Alliance, which was a clean energy coalition of more than 300 labor, business, environmental, and community-based organizations, and was also previously the policy director for Helios Strategies, providing policy and strategy advice to clean energy firms. So Jeff, you obviously come from a varied background. I look forward to hearing what the AFL is thinking about this.
Sure, great. So the AFL-CIO started the Center for Green Jobs in 2009, really as it had been doing for many years, to really take a public policy view on green jobs and the creation of a clean energy economy. Just as a little background, the AFL-CIO is the nation's largest labor federation, made up of 59 affiliate unions and representing over 12 million members nationwide. It is a big and complicated institution in the country, and I usually say I'll make my remarks brief because it's best understood through the Socratic method, and so we can get to the question and answer session. But our start in this, labor has always been a key ally in the passage of major environmental legislation through the course of the late 20th century. Not always easily, not without a great deal of negotiations, but there along the way. And I think at different variations of the BlueGreen Alliance in the 70s and 80s around the Clean Air Act or increasing CAFE standards. But most recently, in this iteration of what we look at as green jobs, it was really around clean energy and energy efficiency. And I think our first entrance in this round would have been through coalitions with the Apollo Alliance and subsequently the BlueGreen Alliance, looking at public policy measures that would help to create and spur green jobs growth. And when we initially did that, we focused mostly at the state and local level because there were places where in the political landscape we felt like we could get wins that would do two things. One, pass regulations that would create demand for clean energy, and two, pass public investment measures that would create the resources there to spur a recently growing market. With an eye to not only creating real-world examples of how powerful this is economically, but also to convince at the state level federal delegations that these policies were effective and popular and could take them and turn them into federal legislation. So looking through that lens, the culmination for us would have been the passage of the Recovery Act and the large investment for clean energy that was part of that. And that would have been, it was historic, and would have been more monumental if it hadn't have come against the backdrop of our current economic crisis. And the fact of the matter is we recognize that it wouldn't have come around if it had not been in response to an economic crisis. But I think we feared at the time and came to be true was that the economy was eroding much faster and deeper than we anticipated, and the Recovery Act was not big enough to keep up with that. So, as we find ourselves, today in a policy landscape that's, as everyone recognizes, very complicated, between attention around stimulus and investment and fiscal austerity, and not just in this country but around the world. The labor movement decided to move from public policy to private policy, looking at how we can use our own resources to help at least give some sort of kickstart to or maintain some momentum around the green energy economy. And as part of that, in June, the AFL-CIO made a commitment as part of the Clinton Global Initiative to do 4 things. One was to create a $10 billion infrastructure fund but to facilitate a fund amongst our pension funds to invest $10 billion in a wide range of infrastructure projects. As part of that, to also work with our pension funds to create a $40 million demonstration project fund for commercial and industrial retrofit. Seeing that energy efficiency is probably the lowest hanging fruit, as Secretary Chu would say, when it comes to the clean energy economy. Recognizing that it's already a mature industry that has several major players, that has a track record of success, but as a result of the kind of recession that we went through, was lacking for capital. Third, emphasizing that we want a new economy that requires skill, which requires skill that brings with it good wages and benefits, to emphasize the training component of this, and committed to doing upgrade training with 100,000 construction apprentices and initiating 40,000 new construction apprentices over the course of the commitment. And finally, and more appropriately, to retrofit our own headquarters, which is one of my pet projects, and it's kind of a welcome departure from the policy world these days. And so, we've been working at a frenetic pace over the course of the summer, seeing significant progress on creation of the larger fund with a number of the public pension funds, including those involving the AFT, NEA, American Federation of Teachers, National Education Association, Service Employees International Union. The California pension funds, public pension funds, are leading the way on that. We're expecting many others to pile on as we get the details worked out of that. And working on a number of local projects to demonstrate the benefits of doing commercial and industrial retrofits. As a segue to my final comments, I think when we started this, or when I started back in this version of the movement, we did a lot of the state and local stuff, and I think that now I urge people, as we start to help to prime the pump to get private monies moving into the market, that we return to looking at what we can do, particularly at the local level. I mean, I think we all intuitively know, but underestimate how much of energy consumption and energy generation, or almost in its entirety, happens at the local level, and the untapped potential we have there in the public policy realm. And I hope that Bracken will be able to talk about a few examples there that we can use to keep the momentum going, even when we can't get more macro policy initiatives underway.
Great, thank you. And Jeff, I now have visions of you in worker gear retrofitting the AFL's building, so I'm glad you're finding some outlet for your creative side there. One worker at a time here. So to round up the panel before we open it up for discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Bracken Hendricks, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a think tank here in D.C. He was actually the founder of the Apollo Alliance, and has worked extensively with both the Obama and Clinton administration, as well as on the Hill around the energy portions of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And Bracken, I think I'm interested in hearing from you a little bit. In many ways, we know what the policies are that we need to do. That's not necessarily the most complicated piece. It's like the politics of how do we get this done.
Yeah.
And we are a little bit in the Wild West here in Washington these days, and so some perspectives perhaps on where have we been and where are we going in terms of creating that demand.
Great. And I think the question of politics and creating demand is exactly the right question. And sort of looking across this panel, we've had an incredibly strong case made about the fundamental economics of green jobs and building a more prosperous, a more efficient economy. We were just talking about the Apollo Alliance, and Jeff and I, going back 10 years ago when we started putting together the Apollo Alliance, actually it was started really at the Working for America Institute, within the labor movement, kind of incubating this conversation. There's a question of how change happens. And we've had conversations about capital investment streams. We've had conversations about political momentum. We've been working over this last 10 years to create a vocabulary of green jobs, of investment, of looking at solving the climate crisis as a tremendous economic opportunity, an opportunity of huge magnitude, hundreds of billions of dollars domestically annually, $5 to $10 trillion over the next decade globally. There's huge amounts of capital that has to be put to work. There's a very familiar graph that's really kind of a touchstone for me. It's very familiar for many in the climate community. It's called the Princeton wedges, or Sokoloff and Pakala are two social scientists at Princeton, and they wanted to make real the magnitude of doing the work of building a clean energy economy. And so they looked at what it would take to get 7 billion gigatons of atmospheric CO2 reductions. I mean, I study this stuff, and I have no concept of what 1 billion gigatons of atmospheric CO2 reduction is or looks like. So they said, well, what does it mean? It's bricks and mortar. It's cutting in half the vehicle miles traveled for billions of cars at a time when every year vehicle miles traveled are growing. It's hundreds of times the deployment of solar. It's 60 times the global deployment of wind to get a single billion-ton reduction. It's a huge investment agenda in steel, in concrete, in skilled work. There was very good conversation about the actual skill sets, the actual workers who are implicated, and the macroeconomic consequences of moving from investments in pollution to investments in clean energy and in these solutions. But having spent the last decade really focused on how to create this vocabulary about the opportunity, I actually want to just take a minute and talk about the climate crisis, because we can't walk away from it, and especially in a global conversation when we're dealing with tremendous issues of equity and disparity in terms of wealth, and also in terms of the consequences of climate impacts. We really have to look at it. And so coming back to Margarete's question about the politics, there's a fundamental reality that we have to comprehend, which I think is very, very difficult. In most human challenges, the status quo is an option. If you do nothing, you have stasis. You continue on a business as usual path. Global warming is a situation where doing nothing leads to very, very radical change. Tremendous costs, tremendous pain, tremendous suffering, tremendous economic consequences and economic disruptions. So we're faced really with two different pathways that involve substantial change. So really what we're talking about is looking out at the future. We can choose an investment stream that builds a future that we want, that creates dignity, that creates opportunity, that creates hope, and that creates more prosperity and more economic development, or we can do nothing but accept tremendous change. And so what we spent the bulk of this conversation was really making the case for the substantial benefits, an order of magnitude greater benefits that are available if you assume a baseline where inaction is an option. you actually get a better deal from investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy and a smart distributed electricity grid that's self-healing so you don't have power outages, and mobility and smarter, healthier communities. You get, in the U.S. context, we've looked at it, it's about 4 times the jobs created from these green investments in manufacturing and construction when compared to oil. It's about 3 times the jobs created when compared to investing the same dollar in coal, and taking that dollar and investing it instead into green energy choices and smart buildings connected through a smart electricity grid. So the fundamental economics are substantially better, but I just want to underscore that this is against a backdrop where it's not against a costless scenario. What we're doing is actually investing in our own survival, and I think that's too easily lost. However, there's another political consequence from this. It is very, very difficult in times of economic austerity, times of pain, economic dislocation, to mobilize people solely around fear or around long-term conceptions of dislocation or pain or even social justice. So in the United States, when we're looking at pink slips at factories, when we're looking at mortgage crises that have people facing eviction from their homes, it's very, very difficult to organize around the climate crisis. And even in a country that has a fairly good consensus, when you just really drill down on climate and a willingness to invest in clean energy solutions, it's very hard to mobilize. So this language of the economic opportunity is very important at a political level. But I think it's also important at a policy level. And here I think the politics and the policy are very, very closely related. Putting this in a global context, there's been a lot of work globally around global treaties, binding limits on CO2 emissions, what could have happened in coming out of Kyoto and Copenhagen, and all of the treaties that could have been engaged in more forcefully, the domestic laws with cap and trade, with a whole set of pollution controls that could have been passed. But I just want to put out on the table that had we been wildly successful in negotiating a treaty, had we been wildly successful in passing binding carbon caps, we still would have had to wake up the next morning and rewire the electrical grid and build a new generation of smart buildings that are capable of using advanced technology to squeeze out 20, 30, 40, 50%, getting to net zero buildings. We still would have had to turn over our automobile fleet. These policy tools would have been very helpful, but they wouldn't actually do the work. So if you look at this as a multi-trillion-dollar challenge globally, this is the single largest stream of new value-added economic opportunities that will increase productivity, that will create new economic opportunity. So this is a huge engine. So taking off my environmental hat, this is actually a technology deployment challenge, which is another reason why the Sokolov and Pacala wedges are so instructive. And we've actually had total transformation of infrastructures globally within the last decade, for telecommunications, for internet, with mobile phones. Just looking at the leapfrogging of development patterns in less developed countries, we've bypassed a generation of infrastructure and invested instead in leading-edge technology because we made it cheaper to build base stations for cellular transmission rather than laying copper wire. One of the core problems, really at its heart, is that the investment challenge is kind of unfamiliar. This is both an IT transformation challenge, which we're used to investing in with private equity and venture capital, and it's an infrastructure challenge, which we're used to investing in with long-term stable debt through bonds and other sorts of things. And we've got a capital market that doesn't really know how to invest in it, and we've got hundreds of billions of dollars sitting on the sideline waiting for the next economic opportunity. You mentioned Solyndra. Solyndra was a very important and well-meaning effort and part of a much larger portfolio of investments that were about moving capital where it needs to go. And it starts with very, very innovative investments that are extremely high risk, taking place at national labs. We have a new institution that was also funded. Jeff mentioned the Recovery Act, something called ARPA-E, which is taking our Department of Defense incubation of science and trying to incubate really, really high-risk businesses where they only expect a few to succeed. And then a loan guarantee program where there was really expected a fairly high rate of failure, but a manageable rate of failure to commercialize risky new technologies. And then there's a suite of policies that are about making capital cheap in deployment. We have a renewable energy standard that makes it financeable to build wind farms and other proven technologies. There's proposals for green banks that simply just drive a couple points off the cost of capital so that when you need to make a consideration, a rate base hearing, are you going to build another natural gas plant or are you going to build a concentrated solar plant, the cost of the power has to meet a consumer protection test. So if you drive down the cost of that capital with cheaper interest rates, you can make renewables viable. Putting aside a price on carbon, putting aside binding treaties, we can use the markets that we have to make this stuff work, to make it financeable, to make it investable. So there's a very coherent policy agenda. And every day in the United States and every day globally, we invest over and over again in incubating small businesses, in training workers, in capturing manufacturing, in building competitive infrastructures, and in retooling and reskilling our workforce for a changing, very, very dynamic workplace. What we haven't done is apply our existing system of economic development to the task of transformation. And I think that's what's so exciting about the UN's leadership in putting the Global Green Deal on the table, in using the Rio +20 process to put a global agenda of green jobs and green economic development on the table, to the sorts of things the World Bank and others have been talking about new financial mechanisms to help move capital investments in different directions. We actually have many, many tools at hand. We could have more. It could be easier. But I would put to you that we have enough of the right tools if we view global warming not as an environmental challenge, but as a tremendous economic challenge with global environmental repercussions, where if we don't get the economics right, we're going to trash the environment and we're going to destroy our viability as a species. So I actually think that the green jobs challenge, the green jobs language is critically important because it places power back in our laps and in our hands as we make investment decisions. And it makes us think differently about a green economy, not as some subset of corporate social responsibility or regulatory initiatives at the margins trying to stop a fundamentally harmful economy, but instead a green jobs discussion can make us look at green as a lens for the entire global economy as we strive to have a more productive, more effective, more efficient, and ultimately survivable economy. So I think we're really all looking forward to a very open and engaged conversation, and hopefully you won't be shy.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for the very valuable. Abigail, I know we started a little bit late, so I just want to do a time check with you in terms of you will tell us when we're starting to run out of time. I know you have a program to keep. Thank you. And Abigail has been great, by the way, from UNEP in helping organize this session, so thank you. So this is a very interesting conversation. And, part of the struggle that I think, and I might have a hard time seeing people when you raise your hand, so just wave if I don't see you. And are there mics also, Abigail, for people? Okay, so we have people, you see volunteers on the side. Oh, great. We can see each other. Something about being on a stage with light. I don't know. So if you do have questions or have inputs, signal. But I think part of this challenge and the frustration, right, is that we have sort of seen the lights and believe that these sectors could grow. We see them grow, even if they are in the smallest sectors. We see this different trend, right? Even in the midst of a recession, there are pockets of growth and so forth. Yet we're sitting here in a country and in a city where we still even debate climate change and global warming, and that's a legitimate question, that folks on the Hill will say, well, that's not even a real problem. We have people attacking the Environmental Protection Agency for even having a role in regulating emissions. I mean, we are so far behind in so many ways. To your comment, if U.S. can't do this, what can we do? On the flip side is we absolutely have shown that we can, so we look to the world to kind of provide some of that leadership. I'm just curious what you see as sort of the bright spots in terms of how we push this forward in terms of job creation. Not much is going to happen in Washington. Are there regional policies that have worked? How do we buck the trend? How do we get those small companies to actually grow at the scale that they need to? And so kind of in the face of all these attacks and skepticism in this country, and knowing that the world is looking to us in many ways, what do you see as the bright spots? And what are some of the most effective strategies that you have seen work? And is that enough? Does that get us to where we need to be? I'm going to open it up just for sort of general. You don't all have to respond, but I'm just curious what you would highlight.
I could start here. So to your question, there are a lot of interesting questions there. But to the question of why U.S. politics is the way it is and what could be done to generate more support for green policies, one thing to look at would be what parts of the country support green policies. We did a study where we looked at the congressional districts that supported the last major piece of U.S. environmental legislation, the Cap and Trade Act. And if you look at what parts of the country voted for it and what parts voted against it, it's very highly correlated with fossil fuel production and use. And so I think the case needs to be made to people in West Virginia, Kentucky, Texas, parts of the country that are heavily involved in fossil fuels, that this is something that can benefit them. This isn't about taking away their jobs or putting a burdensome tax on the activities that drive their metropolitan economies, but providing a new set of opportunities that will be growing more in the future and solving important challenges that they may even recognize already are a part of their communities in terms of air quality and so on. But it's one of the reasons, I think, why there's been such fierce opposition to subsidies to Solyndra, for example, which was out in San Jose. In San Jose and in most of California, you will not find tremendous opposition to the loan guarantees program. But you will see that in places where they think, well, we can never make solar here. And so part of what we try to do in our report is actually to highlight the parts of the country where there are green jobs in places where you might not expect it. Houston, Texas, for example, is the fossil fuel capital of the United States. But it also has a very strong growing clean tech sector. Vestas, the Danish wind maker, has opened a new plant there. There are many other examples. The mayor of Houston, for two mayors in a row, have aggressively supported purchasing electric vehicles for the public fleet and buying a large percentage of their electricity from renewable makers. So there is progress in places of the country that you would not necessarily expect. I could give many more examples, but that's just one perspective to bring.
Great. Anybody else? And then I had one question here, and then one here, and then two there. So you had your hand up, right? But before we turn it, anybody else who want to weigh in on?
I'd just like to jump in on the bright spots and the what's working discussion. And I also want to echo praise for the Brookings paper that Jonathan's worked on. It's something that folks really should look into. It's really worth taking the time. I'm not sure if I have the numbers exactly right, but Jonathan mentioned that it's the smallest and newer sectors that are growing fastest. I believe the numbers are 8.3% growth over a decade in clean tech, which is about twice the 4.2% growth rate in the economy overall. Do I have those?
That's per year, although it doesn't. Both numbers don't take into account establishment closing, so it's a little complicated. But yes, that is correct.
For a simple person like me, it's good enough for roughly 2x. That's kind of how I relate to it. Okay, so clean tech over a decade growing roughly twice the rate of the global economy. I mean, of the U.S. domestic economy. That's right. That's pretty cool. That's something that's working, and it's something that's working in the absence of policy. And it's a powerful place to look when we're having very significant stagnation, a jobless recovery where you can argue that there is recovery, and in certain sectors, like construction, arguably it's a sustained depression. So this is something that's working, and it's something very important to take notice of. Jeff mentioned energy efficiency as the low-hanging fruit, or as Secretary Chu likes to say, it's the fruit that's already on the ground. But there's a problem of, why aren't we able to capture energy efficiency? And one of the things that I think is really exciting about this, it's one of the things that's very frustrating, but it's also encouraging, is that there's a lot that can be done with policy, but there's a lot that's also just a challenge to new business models or new public-private partnerships. So, figuring out how to secure these new investments, how to really stand up a whole new industry that doesn't quite exist yet in the management of buildings and driving smart, innovative technologies into buildings. It's a finance challenge that the banks are trying to figure out. There are tools for credit enhancement and specific policies that we can put to work. So I see a lot of potential in not sitting on our hands and waiting for more federal legislation, but really trying to dig down into particular challenges in technology deployment to take this clean tech, put it into use, build market demand for these companies that are growing, and help create demand for the skills of workers. And that's actually a fairly empowering position to get at, and the economics are very good.
Great. So I see a lot of hands, and I think what we will do is I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll do a couple of questions and then see if we get some feedback. But please say your name and where you're from, and then the lady here is next when you get the mic back.
Okay. I'm Dick Ottinger. I'm with Pace University Law School and IUCN. And the thing that puzzles me is that all of these developments that you're discussing require substantial investments. And with the federal government cutting back enormously, do you really think that the private sector can be persuaded to invest at a pace that's necessary to overcome the climate changes? And then where does the money come from? What the folks on the right were talking about, which is vital for education, training, R&D. The federal government's getting out of that. Where does that come from? How can it be stimulated?
Great. Do you mind taking the microphone up here? How do we pay for this, you guys? Jordan?
I have a thought on this. When we engage in our low-carbon growth studies, or when McKinsey does its marginal abatement curves, there's something always funny about this, about the way things pan out. This is related to the last comment we heard, that there's a bunch of interventions that somehow have already a net positive return. That would reduce. This is just emissions. One slice of the green pie. But there's all these investments that, you have to ask yourself why people aren't just picking up the fruit that's on the ground, to use the metaphor that we just heard. And in some of the economies where we work, it's a huge part of the emissions story, that there should be a whole bunch of policy interventions that are already net positive return for the government if they do it, regardless of a value put on carbon. Right? So even without some sort of carbon tax, or without a tradable market that's induced by a cap and trade system. And much of this, I think, comes down to education. It comes down to political incentives, and to some of the financing things that we're talking about. It might be that the upfront costs are formidable for some people, but the overall, the present value of that cost pays for itself. This is something that I think there's room for institutions like ourselves with very little leverage to help release the funding for. We're starting to finance energy efficiency projects that are not just rebuilding buildings, but helping to finance individual households to turn in old appliances. And it actually is not costly. It returns itself. It pays for itself. It's just that there hasn't been the financing mechanism available for people to do this before. So with a little bit of liquid in the system, you find that these things pay for themselves. And that's where the co-benefit issue comes in as well. When we start to explain to the mayors of the developing world exactly what the costs are, the economic and budgetary costs are to congestion and to public health, oftentimes you can get them to invest in bus rapid transit systems, integrated mass transport systems, without having to engage them in a discussion about the global public good of climate change. when they themselves are just trying to survive the next 3 years to the next mayoral election. So that's a partial answer. It's not a complete answer, but I think that some of these things are a market failure that can be fixed with some degree of information sharing, a little bit of help on releasing the financing, and then also valuing the co-benefits that come with doing things right, not just the greenhouse gas partial answer.
Just quickly on that, though. I mean, I want to emphasize that the $10 billion that we're putting up in an investment fund is private capital. That's just a very tiny fraction of $6 trillion or $5 to $6 trillion in pension capitals that are jointly managed by labor unions and employers. And as part of that, the training that we're talking about is entirely privately funded as part of collective bargaining agreements.
Great. So what we'll do is, because I'm getting the signal here now, so we'll do this here and a couple over here, and then as a closing, we don't really have a closing session, but you guys can help wrap it up based on the comments that we're hearing. So you're first.
Thank you very much. Kirsty Schneeberger from Stakeholder Forum and working with the New Economics Foundation and Institute on the Global Transition. I'm wondering to what extent panelists are engaging in the debate about the green and fair economy and how social equity comes into the green economy discussion. And then 2 subpoints to that. Firstly, in particular the Brookings Institute, I'd be interested to hear what's the role of the informal economy in delivering the green and fair economy. And then also, how are you engaging in the debate about going beyond GDP or looking at other indices to measure well-being, other indices to measure prosperity? Thank you.
Great. We're going to just get a couple so we get people. So it was first you in the back there, I think? Oh, okay. We'll get the 2 of you and then.
Thank you. My name is Lauren Sorkin, and I'm from the Asian Development Bank. And my question is, what about food production? We've heard the information about energy and transport sectors so many times, and where does the conversation about producing local, organic food, land use change come into the debate? Back here in the United States visiting, you see the epidemic of obesity everywhere. And as the colleague from McKinsey said, you've witnessed the change from farm to city. In Vietnam, where I work, we're watching that happen in very real time, and I'm sure the colleague from Latin America from the World Bank also witnessed this. So what are we seeing in terms of the possibility for quality on-farm and natural resource-based jobs? And where is that in this research? And how do we also tie that into the importance of creating local and regional resilience to climate change and economic shocks?
Great. Then there was a comment back there, and then are you still on? Okay. You'll be the last one. Did you see him in the middle?
Hi, I'm Lily Donge with Calvert Investments, and my question is along the side of the ADB question, which is our definition of green jobs expands to the adaptation side. So, Bracken, I really appreciate your comments about the cost scenario, because at the end of the other side of the spectrum of climate change are the jobs made due to resiliency of general infrastructure, general economic development. And if it's really hard, and I would really value any institute that can put boundaries and do a study on the jobs created by the physical impacts of climate change and expand it rather than just to clean energy or mitigation jobs to a larger pool to see in a world in 2030 or 2050 or what that infrastructure, that the entire economy will look like. Because our definition of environment and green jobs is definitely the entire spectrum of climate change.
Great. So we have one more person in the middle here. And then what I will ask our panelists to do is sort of integrate, because we could be here for a long time, and these are the right kinds of questions to integrate your thoughts on.
She asked 3 questions, which was totally unfair, too.
You can pick which one you want to answer of those 3. But all right, sir, you're the last one.
My name is Mahesh Jayakumar. I'm from State Street. Mine kind of coincides with Lily's question in terms of, have you guys looked at old world industries being greened? Is there something like green concrete or green steel to make? People always tell me wind and solar, which is great, but what about the need for green infrastructure truly from a materials perspective? What are your thoughts on that?
Great. So we're going to start just by to wrap up and just do it in this order, I think, in terms of both answering those questions and also obviously listening to each other. So John, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Yeah, I'm actually going to return back for just a second to the question around investment, right? And there is, even in the, kind of most favorable scenarios, we do need to raise capital up front in order to make a transition here, right? There is a retooling that happens, particularly in the developed economies. The challenge is always around how do you sequence effectively such that you get some of the things that have returns on them up front, and at the same time bring down the costs on the things that are more expensive now but need our research, development, and deployment to ultimately prove them out and drive them down to a lower cost level so that they can be solutions for tomorrow. So there is absolutely that need for capital. Again, even energy efficiency, which is, has a return on it, requires upfront investment for long-term returns. So you need to figure out a way to harvest that. And there are different approaches that you can use. There are pay-as-you-save programs and things like that allow you to start annuitizing some of the benefits and bringing forward the costs. There are different kind of innovations there that you can use. And I would actually call upon this community to help provide some of the green financing that allows, kind of the upfront capital to be matched with the long-term benefits as we make these transitions.
Great. Since we are running out of time, I'm going to ask you guys to be super short because I don't want to get on her bad side. That's a really bad thing to do. We want to stay in UNEP's good grace here. So I'm going to just keep us plowing and try and answer questions that others didn't.
Okay, I'll try to rapidly address a few of these. So on the agricultural side, there is considerable growth in the organic food market in the United States. This has been a trend that's been going on for a number of years with very little policy support, frankly. You see a sort of greening, more sustainable trend in many consumer markets. And it's a way for U.S. agricultural producers to compete with lower cost producers from the rest of the world in many ways. As to the question on concrete and building materials, that is something that we included in our study. I can't tell you off the top of my head how many jobs are related to green concrete or something along those lines, but definitely there are organizations that are keeping track of that progress, and it's an important thing to consider because it can make a big difference. As to the equity issue, my expectation is that growth in the green economy, at least in the United States, will reduce income inequality, largely because there are disproportionate opportunities at better pay for workers who have less education. And insofar as that growth will continue, especially in U.S. manufacturing, it will offset some of the losses in manufacturing jobs that have contributed to U.S. inequality over the last 30 years.
Great. I'm going to keep it right over. We're solving all the world's problems in rapidly real time here, and I apologize, but we are running out. I want to make sure everybody gets some time. So,
I want to choose my two favorite questions. The question of inclusiveness is hugely important for us because we were supposed to be an institution dedicated to the alleviation of poverty, not the alleviation of greenhouse gases. And it seems too facile to say that. That's the right pronunciation of that word, I'm not sure. It seems too easy, is that right? It seems too easy to say that all things that are good for the environment are good for the poor. And the affordability question is really big in my mind, and I think that we haven't fully tackled it yet. We're starting to look at it now. There's a lot of research at the bank on this particular topic, and I would guess in your own institutions, organizations, you're starting to look at it as well. But just to give us one example of where we see some pressure, in Mexico right now, we see 8-cylinder engines and SUVs are booming as oil prices are rising, and it might be in part because of the subsidies that go into energy. In Mexico, it might also be because of NAFTA and the fact that the U.S. is forcing junker laws to be liberalized in Mexico, and it's easier and easier to buy secondhand cars from the States. So when we go to Mexico and we say, look, you need to raise your fuel prices, you need to tighten these laws, you also were the same people you're telling somebody, look, your first car may not be, your family's first car may not be this generation, it might be the next generation. It's not always an easy thing to balance. We have to think a lot about the equity issue. And we should meet for coffee to talk about food production and land use. And I think that my own view is that the organic story is something that's different from the agriculture. Oh, did you leave? Did she ask that question? Oh, you're there. Okay. Even with my
You are
glasses.
so indignant.
I am. I don't know what I'm indignant about. Sorry.
That's fair trade coffee you're
exactly. But it's a great question. It's
and if you had left, he would have tracked you down for coffee.
I would have tracked you down for coffee to discuss it.
We know where you live. Thank you for that, Jeff.
Sure.
Do you want
Sure. So I'll take the first question and the last question as quickly as I can. And that is to say, part of the reason I'm obsessed with construction right now is that we see it as a pathway out of poverty. And so we're working in 5 cities right now to work with community training programs to implement a building trades certified pre-apprenticeship program to help people to get access to the apprenticeship programs and to create demand for that. We're trying to do these, first the retrofits, but any sort of infrastructure construction. And then as part of that, part of the retraining that we're doing, and it was part of our Clinton commitment, is that really on training on new materials, new green materials, training our journeyman construction workers on how to use new materials in green construction is going to be a lot of that. And a lot of our struggle is trying to convince union members that they're already doing green jobs. And I think that's as true of construction as it is of auto workers right now and many other manufacturing.
Yeah. Great. And let me just sort of thread those 2 bookends through the conversation about food equity and adaptation as well. On the first point about is there, can we get it done with just the private sector in a moment when government tools in the United States are so paralyzed? I think that's actually, we need to flip that entirely on its head. This is a challenge for the entire private sector. What we are looking at is moving the velocity and the flows of private capital markets, of all private businesses, and changing business models. Certainly government tools are probably the fastest, most efficient and effective way to start changing the rules that shape the market, but they're not the only way. And the kinds of transformations in how we think about the skills of the workforce, the ways our technology function, this is ultimately, I mean that very literally when I say that green has to be a lens for looking at the entire economy, and that includes driving in equity concerns. There are more jobs, better jobs, and more equitably available jobs in the green economy than in a waste-driven fossil fuel economy. It's fundamental to the economic proposition. So taking on issues of limited soil, limited clean air, limited clean water, we are talking about taking those as design principles about how we reimagine the functioning of the economy. And absolutely, it's about linking the food system and the availability of health and drinking water and the assimilative capacity of the atmosphere. These are fundamental building blocks of the economy that we've ignored through the Industrial Revolution. And really what we're talking about is a maturation of how we look at economic productivity and prosperity and driving that into our accounting, driving it into our tools for assessing wealth and prosperity and the outcomes of our investments. And at that point, that really is our path to survival. But it's at that moment when the private sector is doing the work of the green economy, and that's really the core green jobs thesis.
Great. So with that, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to our panel. It's never an either or, I guess is what it also comes down to. We do need policies, we need investment, we need ambition in terms of the scale of what we're trying to accomplish. We need the concrete stories of what is working in the midst of all these challenges and attacks that we're facing. I think this is the right mix also of people to be thinking about some of this, because we do need civil society, we need labor, we need a demand to be built up, we need to see these practical solutions, the equity questions, we need the data to show what we are doing, and we need the global perspective. And so this was a very interesting conversation. I think we could have gone on for a long time and probably heard much more for you. Be that as it may, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. We hope to see you. Thanks again to UNEP for putting it on. And any last minute stuff you need to say? Be on your way. Thank you very much.